Where will you find your right to vote? And what rights are those these days? I'm Lee Rayburn, and our first guest today continues in our examination on civics, and we want to invite you to the conversation. If you have a question about the ballot, our elections, some of the myths you've had, if you're a poll worker, we invite you to join us at 1-800-642-1234. That's 800-642-1234. Or send an email to talk@wpr.org. Bill and Barnes, I see you there, and we'll get to you in just a moment. But first, let me introduce our guest. David Schultz returns, Distinguished University Professor of Political Science and Legal Studies at Hamline University, also a Professor of Law at the University of St. Thomas School of Law, and a Professor at the Lithuanian Military Academy. His third edition of his constitutional law textbook is forthcoming. And David, welcome back to the show. David, are you muted? Well, while we're setting David up, I guess.
Okay, we're set.
All right, set. There he is.
Muted. I was muted. Sorry.
Happens to the best of us, David. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me again, and my apology.
No problem. And let's just start with where we find our rights to vote. And we can start with the U.S. Constitution. Do we find it there?
We actually find nowhere explicitly in the Constitution a right to vote. And that makes us unusual compared to almost every other, let's say, major democracy in the world where there's some clause written somewhere that guarantees a right to vote. So in the original Constitution, there was no explicit language. And I would argue that even to this day, the right to vote is not explicit, and I'll call it a negative right. And what I mean by a negative right, there are reasons why the government can't prevent us from voting, but we still have no affirmative right to vote that it's explicitly, clearly written in the Constitution.
But there's nothing in the Bill of Rights, but what about, say, the 15th Amendment?
Well, if you look at the text of the 15th Amendment, that basically, which was one of the Reconstruction amendments after the Civil War, it says the right to vote shall not be denied on account of race. Look at the race or ethnicity or previous servitude. Look at the 19th Amendment that says the right to vote shall not be denied on account of sex. Look at the 26th Amendment. The right to vote shall not be denied on account of age, basically 18 years old. They all say reasons why you can't be denied the right to vote, but they don't explicitly say you have a right to vote.
Interesting. Let's go to a poll worker now. Bill and Barnes joining us along with David Schultz. Hi, Bill.
Good morning. Thanks for taking my call. And I'm gratified as an amateur, always finding myself on mute when a Zoom call. It happens to the pros too. So my question kind of comes in two parts. The first is that at registration, a person is asked if they have a wager on the election, but at the time of the poll, when you come to the poll to vote, that question is not asked. So if you're in the same district year after year, you're never going to be asked that question, and it is a disqualifier for voting if you have a wager on the outcome of the election. So now come the online betting parlors, Kalshi, I think it's pronounced, DraftKings, that the federal government has called commodity markets, not betting parlors. And my question is, has it been adjudicated or decided that having a position on one of these online betting parlors constitutes a wager on the election that would disqualify you from voting? And if you do, why are we not asking that question?
Bill, thank you. And David, what do you think about these betting markets, online betting forums? Like I think Polymarket's another one that's been brought up.
Okay, a couple of different thoughts here. The first one is I suspect that the reason why there's laws about waging and betting on it has something to do with political bribery and whether or not somebody is being paid or induced to vote and so forth like that. I suspect that's the reason, although I'd have to do more research on it. But second, um, I wonder if in fact these laws that such as that wager law might actually violate the First Amendment right to free speech.
Huh.
You know, do I have a right to basically be able to say, for example, I bet you that the Democrats or the Republican will win the governor's election. $5, I don't know, a bottle of beer, whatever it may be, or something like that. I suspect something like that is constitutionally protected, and so those wager laws might be unconstitutional in some form, except if there's a part of it that's meant to address political bribery or corruption, then I think the government would have a valid purpose in asking and enforcing them. But otherwise, I would not be surprised if somebody challenges those, they would run adrift of the First Amendment.
Interesting. And Bill, thank you for the call. There is a WPR News story from last month where the Wisconsin Elections Commission cites specifically a state law which would disqualify Wisconsinites from voting in any election in which the person has made or become interested directly or indirectly in any bet or wager depending upon the result of the election. But the the response from both Kalshi and Polymarket, these online betting sites, are that we're not betting at all, but rather commodities. So it's not, I think they're trying to split hairs there. And I think this is certainly an open question, but I had not considered a First Amendment right. But would a Polymarket or Kalshi have that First Amendment right, David?
They might have it, but I think even more importantly, I think the voter might have that
Huh.
First Amendment right. Because again, imagine a scenario where, again, you and I are just, I don't know, we're hanging out in our favorite establishment, and you say to me, I bet you come November X, Y, and Z. And I say, yeah, I don't think you're right. I don't know. And we bet a beer. We just bet a beer or something like that. Or I'll buy you dinner, you buy me dinner, et cetera, et cetera. Like, uh, something tells me the First Amendment would give you and me a right to be able to do that.
This might be something we see end up in the courts at some point,
Uh-huh.
which I would imagine might be the case. And sites like Polymarket and Kalshi might have the resources to take it up the court system and see how far it goes.
Mhm.
And there may be a real defense there. Dylan emailed us. He'd like to hear about ranked voting or any other methods that can help break the two-party deadlock he says that we have now. It seems like most people, according to Dylan, are voting against the candidate they don't want rather than choosing the candidate they actually like best.
No, this is an interesting question here. Okay, not to do any kind of promotions, but I'm in the middle of editing a book on ranked choice voting at this point that we're going to send off to the University of Michigan Press in the next couple of months, in which we're trying to look at this system in terms of what do we know about how well it's worked and how well it's not worked.
Hmm.
Because you're right, what we have right now is a dominance of the two major parties, and we sort of have a couple things that are going on here. One of them is what I call the spoiler effect, is that maybe there's a third party running or a candidate you like, and you say, gosh, I would really like to vote for that third party candidate. But if I do so, it may lead to the candidate I least like getting elected. So ranked choice voting is supposed to solve part of that problem. The other problem that we face, I think a couple of other problems, is I describe the two major parties like two major corporations, both who have incentives to want to keep rivals off the market. Now, let's just say, for example, for my sake of it, they're two large unnamed soda companies, and Schultz comes by with his own cola that's cheaper and tastes better. Do you think those big soda companies want me on the market? The answer is no. So they get to write the rules for ballot access. And so between the spoiler effect, the ballot access, and the fact is that a lot of voters out there, and maybe like this caller, says, I don't line up the way the two parties do. The way I sometimes say it to my students, many of us look at the two parties like two different restaurants. We like some things on some of the menu, some things on the other menu. We'd like to kind of rearrange them or something like that. I think a lot of voters are like that. And so there's some evidence that ranked choice voting will give voters some greater options so that they don't have quite the same hesitancy to vote for a third party candidate. There's some evidence also that ranked choice voting changes the tone of a campaign. Because think about it right now. It's one candidate or one special interest group will call, the rival one, a bunch of dirty, rotten things, horrible things. But with ranked choice voting, it's hard to say my opponent is a scoundrel, but guess what? I vote for me as your second choice. So there's some evidence that it's changing at least the tone. Still not completely clear based upon the research that my contributors have been doing, how much it changes the politics. But I think ranked choice voting is a great experiment that we ought to try as an alternative way of tabulating votes.
And David, the ranked choice voting, instead of marking a box on your ballot, you're actually going through the candidates and marking them one through however many. And then if your number one candidate isn't in the running, then your vote then goes or moves to the number two on the list. Is that about right?
Correct. Yeah, the way I describe it is something simple that I think everybody understands. Again, if I can use the restaurant analogy, let's say you go out to dinner tonight and you ask what's on the menu, and the wait staff says we have beef, chicken, and fish. And you say, I feel like beef tonight. And they say, we just sold the last steak. And you say, okay, my second choice is chicken.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's go with it. I mean, that's ranked choice voting. We I don't know about you, we rank all the time in our life. And so for people who want to say, well, ranked choice voting is difficult or hard for people to figure out, I think we do that all the time. I think we do it all the time in our behavior.
Thank you for the email, Dylan. Thank you for the call, Bill. Our guest, David Schultz, professor of political science, law, and legal studies, taking a look at our civic right to vote and where that comes from, where we will find it, and how to protect it. You can join our conversation with your questions or your stories at 1-800-642-1234. That's 800-642-1234. You can send an email like Dylan did to talk@wpr.org. So where does our right to vote exist then? It seems to me that this would be pretty much left to the states, David?
Well, first off, all 50 states do, under their own constitutions, guarantee a right to vote.
Okay.
But under the federal constitution, we find it located in a couple of places. And so for the federal races, for the Senate and for the House, it's found in Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution, where the Supreme Court has said that language that says that the House of Representatives shall be chosen by the people. What the court has said is that implicitly grants us a right to vote. And then for state and local elections, it's located in the First Amendment to the First Amendment to the Constitution. But what's interesting to think about here is that it's really not until the New Deal that we see the Supreme Court acknowledging that we have this right to vote in federal elections. And it's really not until the 1960s that the Supreme Court says, you know what, we think we can find located, within the First Amendment, a right to vote in state and local elections. And so this, what I'm going to call it, kind of implicit right to vote, for some of our listeners, might very well be within their lifetime.
That's kind of hard to figure for folks who were born after the 1960s, that this isn't something that has always existed, but something that has had to have fights and protests and legal battles and ongoing debates in order to find what we see after the 1960s up until what about, where we stand today? Or has the right to vote been rolled back since then?
Well, but first, let's walk back in history a little bit here. If we were to go back, because you asked the question about states, that because there was all these disputes in the Constitutional Convention about representation and so forth, the Constitution punted, or the framers punted on the right to vote. Okay, it was left up to the states, and back in 1787, the right to vote, if you were to look across, the 13 states, would have been to say that in order to vote, you had to be white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, male, at least 21, and own land, own real property. Legal restrictions. And I mention this because I do this exercise in my class, for example, and I'll ask my students and say, well, how many of you are, fit all those criteria, et cetera, do you own property? Are you over the age of 21, et cetera, like that? But I'll even go, and I think this is relevant for your listenership too, as I say to them that many of the original states, if you were Catholic, for example, you couldn't vote because the fear was that your loyalty would be to the Pope and not to the government, U.S. government. And so very few people could vote. And so to me, what's become interesting is that legally in 1787, the people who were entitled to vote, under state law, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, male, at least age 21, who owned real property. Okay. Over time, we've dropped most of those in fact, we've dropped all those legal restrictions implicitly or explicitly. But the irony is that the people who actually show up to vote now pretty much look like the same people who were legally allowed to vote back in 1787.
Whoa. Why?
Yes.
Okay, so now all of a sudden I've got the suffragettes in my head saying, what about the women? What about the women voters?
Well, what's happened is that in the last, let's say, 20 years or so, women have now surpassed men in terms of turnout. But you're right. Go back before 1920, women didn't have the right to vote. Even as late, I'm going to say, as the 1970s and 80s, although they had the right to vote, women were not turning out in very high percentages. It's really, I'm going to just say, in the last 25 to 30 years, maybe 40 years, that women now are more likely to vote than men in general elections, but in some special elections and in, let us say, maybe local elections, pretty much parity. So it's and then if we also look at another irony, is that it was the 26th Amendment that lowered the voting age to age 18 in state and federal elections. Because remember, during the Vietnam War, I think the great mantra was, if I'm male, I'm old enough to fight, be drafted, fight, and die, but I can't vote. We lowered the voting age to 18. But more or less, what's happened is since that's happened, the voter turnout for people under the age of 30, and especially for college students, still remains dramatically lower than those over the age of 30.
David, you've got to have an idea or a theory or a hypothesis as to why this is, why our voting, our electorate so closely resembles, at least in recent history, our first voting electorate, going back to the founders and where our election started.
I think there's a few different theories. One of them has been in some situations, what we have is still some, I'll say, economic difficulties in terms of being able to show up to vote. I mean, for many places across the country, it's not a paid holiday. People have to take off from work. They can't afford to do that. For a lot of young people, and I hear this from my students all the time, they'll simply say something to the effect of, I don't know how to go about voting. I don't know what to do, et cetera, et cetera. Many of my students will say to me, and I think this is true in Wisconsin, they'll say, well, as I'm my last year of high school, we don't have a civics class. I don't learn anything about how to vote, et cetera, et cetera. But I also have another theory. I have another theory that I can't prove, okay, that In the Constitution, there are minimum age requirements for federal office. You have to be 25 to be elected to serve in the House, 30 to be a U.S. senator, 35 and a natural born citizen to be the president of the United States. My theory, which I can't prove, is that because of that, young people don't see themselves demographically in Congress or in our federal government. Look at the average person in Congress is, I think, 57, 58 years old, if not older. We've got in recent years, I will simply say, quite old presidents, et cetera, et cetera. I think for a lot of my students, they don't see themselves in the government, and a lot of these office holders really can't bond or connect with younger people. I've actually done a piece elsewhere, and I've made an argument to say that I think we ought to up the minimum age requirements for serving in federal office, lower it back to 18. But I would also difference would also put an age cap on the upper limit. But certainly, I think we ought to say, if you're 18 years old, if you're old enough to join the military, old enough to do all these other things, you're old enough to run for office and if you get elected to serve in the federal government.
What would your age cap be?
You know, I haven't decided if it's 70 or 75. I've gone back and forth on this one because some people are saying term limits, and I think, well, maybe term limits is a possibility. But I would really do sort of the upper age limit and say at some point it's time for us to turn the government over to a next generation and let younger people who've got to live with the consequences of their choices act. Because a lot of my students are saying to me, well, look, at these people are old in Congress. They're not going to be here in 10 or 15 years. Remember, this is them speaking. They don't care about climate change. They don't care about student loan debt, et cetera, et cetera. They're not going to be around. And so my students are saying they don't have to live to the consequences of their choices. So I would basically say, okay, 70, 75, but certainly I believe in the idea of let's now get rid of the minimum age. And maybe that would do more to encourage younger people to say, yeah, I can see myself in this person running for office.
Well, David, it does make some, I mean, I see a connection anyway between an older electorate and older elected officials, that they're more easy to, it's easier for them to see themselves in those elected officials, their values, and also an aspect of affluence that if you're talking about landowners, you're talking about people with some means, and that, you know, that the agenda then would be set on behalf of those with means and not necessarily those who are still looking to acquire it, which largely could be considered younger voters or potential voters.
I think you're absolutely correct. And some people have argued that while part of American history is the gradual process towards universal franchise, which is there's also an ugly side to American history, which has been what I call it, the two waves of great disenfranchisement. After the Civil War, the Republican Party was the party supporting enfranchising the former slaves. It was the Democrats who were representing Dixie, the South, who opposed it. And during Reconstruction, there were all these laws that were passed that expanded voting rights, and it worked. But then after 1876, the era of Jim Crow came in, and we significantly restricted voting rights in America. And we could probably talk more about that after the break.
Yep.
And then since I'm going to say roughly 2000, we've also have a new partisan divide over voting rights in America, except now it appears that the Republicans are more likely to oppose and the Democrats more likely to support.
David Schultz, Distinguished University Professor of Political Science and Legal Studies at Hamline University, Professor of Law at the University of St. Thomas School of Law, and a professor at the Lithuanian Military Academy. Join us with your questions and stories about elections and casting your ballot at 1-800-642-1234 or the Great Disenfranchisements, 800-642-1234, or email talk@wpr.org. You're listening to WPR News. civics today with our guest, David Schultz. I'm Lee Rayburn, and David is a distinguished professor of political science and legal studies at Hamline University. He's also a professor of law at the University of St. Thomas School of Law and a professor at the Lithuanian Military Academy. If you have questions about ballot access, going to the polls, or voting, you can join us at 1-800-642-1234. If you have a story to share, you can email talk@wpr.org. And David, I believe we were talking a little bit about after the Civil War and the Republican Party's push to expand voting rights, especially for freed male slaves. And following that, there was this reaction. You called it the first great disenfranchisement, Jim Crow era, marked by systemic tools to suppress voting, largely from the Democratic Party. And then there seemed to be a sweet spot there. And I'd say maybe from the 1960s until the year 2000, when we had the Bush v. Gore Supreme Court case, that there seemed to be a general consensus on voting rights in this country. But as you were talking before the break, that seems to have changed in the last quarter century.
No, you're absolutely correct. And just sort of walk us back to understand it, what's called the Jim Crow era after, 1876 when Reconstruction ended, goes, you're right, so roughly the 1950s or 1960s. And there were a variety of techniques that were used to keep people from voting. Now, unfortunately, the most explicit form was basically what? Lynchings. This is the Ku Klux Klan. They're lynching, they're cross-burning. But there were other things that were done, for example, people have heard the phrase, grandfather laws, or your grandfathered in. What some states said is that, you were only allowed to vote if your grandfather could vote. If your grandfather was a slave, therefore you couldn't vote, and therefore you couldn't vote, your grandson couldn't vote. Or literacy tests, or poll taxes. All these were used as techniques to keep people, former slaves from being able to vote. And they were effective. By the time you got to the early 20th century, you had, I think by some estimates, less than 1% of African Americans in the South were able to vote. Wow. But over time, the Supreme Court strikes down, many of these provisions. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 is probably one of the greatest pieces of legislation ever in American history in terms of enfranchising people. And you're right, we had. I would call it the same thing, sweet spot, until roughly 2000. And then in 2000, the consensus broke down. First it was the claims of voter fraud. Then it was the claims that there's widespread voter fraud, that we need voter ID. And then in the most recently now, we have claims that is that mail-in voting or mail voting or stolen elections and so forth. Even though the best evidence across the board, from the Heritage Foundation, the Cronkite School of Journalism, across the board, unequivocally points out that there really is no widespread systemic voter fraud in America. I won't go into all the details here today, but I sometimes compare incidences of voter fraud to other things, such as, for example, bowling a 300 game, or getting a hole in one, or being struck by lightning. And we're looking at you have better chances of doing a 300, a hole in one, et cetera, than you do in terms of showing widespread voter fraud. Now, I don't know about you. I've never bowled a 300, and I've never had a hole in one. But we're at an impasse, and we're at an impasse because I said to one of my neighbors recently that you can't win this argument, that if somebody absolutely believes that there's widespread voter fraud, no amount of evidence is going to change their mind. And that's just rooted in this deep, deep partisan divide that we have in our society that also extends to voting and voting rights in America.
And voter disenfranchisement, I would imagine, to some degree. If there are barriers being established to limit access to the ballot, and part of those the arguments for those barriers are based in myth, then you would think that this would be something that would be taking us away from the movement towards enfranchisement, the opportunity for people to cast a ballot, and a real democratic outcome from elections.
No, you're absolutely correct. But what we've also seen is, again, as I point out to people, that almost all the efforts to try to expand voting rights in America have came at the behest of the national government, whether it's Congress, the Supreme Court, the president. But what's happened is that we've seen this breakdown in terms of federal support. And if we look at, for example, as I mentioned a couple minutes ago, arguably the Voting Rights Act, the greatest piece of legislation in terms of expanding voting rights. There's a wonderful book by Chandler Davidson called The Quiet Revolution in the South. It's a brilliant book which talks about the great impact that the Voting Rights Act has had. But under the Roberts Court, we have essentially seen, Supreme Court, we've seen for the most part the Voting Rights Act dismantled. And so we just don't have in place anymore the tools for enforcing voting rights. And we see across the country varieties of efforts to really engage in what I call the second great disenfranchisement.
But isn't the Roberts argument from the Supreme Court saying that we don't need the Voting Rights Act anymore, that the reason that it was created is no longer a foundation for why it must persist?
Well, that's the argument that's saying that it's been successful, but at the same time, as soon as the court said it's been successful, we don't need these provisions anymore because states aren't going to try to do certain types of things. What has happened? Those states have gone back and done those very kind of things again. And so the reason why states weren't doing it is because the Voting Rights Act, the pre-clearance provisions were genuinely good deterrents. I think this was Justice Elena Kagan's argument in one of the cases. She said that, well, the reason why states aren't doing all these kind of nefarious things is because why? It's because the feds and the Supreme Court are policing them to prevent them from doing that.
Let's go to Ann in Marshfield next. Hi, Ann.
Hello. I'm so glad to talk to you. Thank you for having this topic. I find it very sad that we make enemies of each other. One of the saddest phrases I've heard, I haven't heard it so much recently, but in previous years, we need to go back to what our founding fathers intended. And when a lady says that to me, I say, do you realize you would not be able to vote if we went back to what our founding fathers intended? And if a gentleman says it to me, I say, do you realize that if you were a carpenter on someone else's property where you worked for that landowner and you were a gentleman, you would not be able to vote? And they look at me so blankly.
This is why we talk about civics, Ann, and this is why I'm so glad you called and offered a woman's perspective on this as two guys talk about it. Because when you talk about we need to go back to what our founding fathers intended, a lot of this Constitution was written on compromise. A lot of it was written with slavery written into the Constitution and people being, given less than the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That really wasn't in there, but there has been, at the same time, since the Constitution, a push for that, and in this, without saying as much, a push away from what our founding fathers had compromised to intend.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the way I describe it to my students, a simplistic way, is our Constitution was written for a horse and buggy era, and now we're in what we'll just call an internet era, whatever you want to call it here. I said their world was so vastly different with different assumptions about the world, including that slavery was okay. It was okay to say women don't have rights, et cetera, like that. And I would hope that some kind of evolving sense of decency or democracy would say that we shouldn't be locked into what a bunch of, I say to my students, what a bunch of dead white guys thought, 250 years ago. But also, just to point out something that's also important for people to think about here, and the Supreme Court reminded us of this in 2000 in Bush v. Gore. To this day, we have no right to vote for President of the United States. Period. The Electoral College basically says that states shall pick the president by the legislature picking the manner for the electors who pick the president of the United States. It is merely by the grace of our state legislatures that they let us cast votes. But if tomorrow the state of Wisconsin were to say, you know what, we're going to pick the electors who are going to pick the president of the United States, they could do that. And if we think about it, how odd it is to think about, that we're supposed to be a representative democracy, a republic, whatever term you want to use here, but we don't have any direct right to vote for president. The people, it's really funny. I have a friend, maybe some listener who can call in on this one, who actually was an elector in Minnesota that got to cast a ballot. So he was one of the 538 people across the country who actually got to vote for president. That's all. Every 4 years, only 538 people actually get to vote for president of the United States.
But we also had the story of the alternate electors here in Wisconsin with the Biden-Trump election. So there were some questions about the role of the Electoral College when it came to the final outcome of that presidential election, highlighting exactly what you said, David, that we don't vote for a president. We vote for a Rube Goldberg machine, which picks a president.
You're right. And I'll tell a story from Minnesota. I think this is what you're referring to in Wisconsin. Back in, I think it was 2016, Hillary Clinton won the state of Minnesota, but one of the electors wanted to cast the ballot for Bernie Sanders, and we have what's called the faithless electoral law that says, no, you have to vote the way the state vote won. And so the Secretary of State said to the person who wanted to vote for Bernie Sanders, no, step aside, somebody else. And if we think about, again, a whole different show at some point, if we think about the whole idea that if we're going to defend the Electoral College, it's supposed to be that the electors are supposed to be wise sages who look out and pick the best candidate. Well, states basically now say, oh, no, you're going to have to vote a particular way. We're not going to give you any kind of discretion. So it's both democratic and non-democratic at the same time.
And thanks again for the call, but she brought up another issue about returning to what our fathers intended. And I'm always curious about this perspective because I am not licensed to practice law at all, but you are a law professor. And there is this now I feel like it's a large part of the majority of the U.S. Supreme Court, this idea of originalism and how originalism has been used to make decisions about our world today that have helped define our world for all of us. Could you explain a little bit about the originalism theory and then its implications for non-legal people like me?
Sure. Well, the whole originalism theory is supposed to be the theory that says that the Supreme Court shouldn't be exercising discretion. It shouldn't be imposing its own values, and therefore there needs to be an anchor, some anchor that fixes meanings. And if we take Constitution seriously, it ought to be what the Constitution means, and what that fixed anchor ought to be is either the original language, but more importantly, the original text and intention of the framers. So that's the theory. That's the theory of saying that we try to reduce discretion of a court by anchoring it back then. However, there are a lot of problems with this. One of them is the fact that the framers were not all of one mind. They disagreed on lots of different things. Two, should we be locked into, again, interpretations that were from a whole different era? The way I say to my students, for example, is if I were to say to my students, what do you think James Madison, who's the primary architect of the Constitution, what do you think James Madison would think about free speech rights on the internet? And I say to them, I think that's a perfectly ludicrous question to ask because James Madison, even if he were alive, couldn't even envision what the internet was. And so to me, that whole idea is ludicrous, but also to me is that I hope, again, your one female caller was perfect on this, is that, we held a lot of prejudices back in 1787 that I hope we move beyond. I hope we've moved beyond the idea that saying that women can be denied the right to vote, or persons of color, or or that because of your sexual orientation or who you were in love with, we should be able to deny you rights to marriage. And so, to me, there's a sense in which that if democracy means anything, representative democracy means anything, consent of the current governed, not of those who died, 250 years ago.
The way you describe legal originalism makes me think of Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure and bringing characters from the past into the present day and making them deal with it. I think that just sounds, well, it sounds like Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. David Schultz is our guest professor of political science, law, and legal studies, and you can join us at 1-800-642-1234. Email talk@wpr.org. Let's go to Jamie in Algoma next. Hi, Jamie.
Hi, I have a question. Why is it that our primaries are all split up and at different times? By the time we get to choose here in Wisconsin, they've been pretty much whittled down. Why can't we have it all in one day as in the general?
I feel you on that, Jamie. It feels like by the time our time is to vote in a nationwide primary, David, that our vote really doesn't count. It doesn't mean much, if anything.
Right. Well, this is actually a really good question in a couple of different ways here, is that remember that the Constitution says that states are primarily responsible for running federal elections subject to restrictions of time, manner, and place. What that means is that states run their own elections. They get to set the dates for primaries. They also, by the way, I should point out, that also means that the federal government has no control over purely state elections for state offices. And so for people who are saying, well, the federal government can tell states what to do with their own elections, no, they can't. But what we get to is a situation where each state wants to game the system. And so for how many years it was that Iowa, we're talking about presidential primaries, it actually was a caucus, I'm sorry, with Iowa. Iowa wanted to be important, so it said, we're going to go first. And then New Hampshire said, we're going to go second. It was just to game the system because then they would attract all these people, money, and importance like that. And that's why, because we have an incredibly decentralized system. Now, would it make a lot more sense to have either a national primary day, or at one point there was an effort, remember, we used to call it Super Tuesday.
Sure.
It was an effort to try to say, let's have a whole bunch of regions of the country, like let's say maybe the South does the first Tuesday of March, and then like the North or something like that, or the Midwest like that. But this requires all these different states to cooperate with one another, and of course, they all want to compete against one another instead. And so it becomes maddening. I mean, the other thing that becomes so maddening about it is the fact that what it does is also expands the length of let's say a presidential election. As I will tell people, literally or figuratively, maybe I was going to say literally, within 2 days after the November elections this year, somebody's going to start to travel to South Carolina or another state to begin searching out to run for president of the United States. Because, now South Carolina is going to be the first state for a primary for the Democrats. And so we basically have a 2-year process to pick president of the United States. And most of us, would really like to have, I think, a much shorter election process. But because states administer it, it's so decentralized, they all game the system. We've got this incredibly drawn-out process. There's this great cartoon from a long time ago. I wish I could find it. Back in the days when pollsters used to go door to door. This is so back in the 40s and 50s. It shows a pollster knocking on the door and barks out and says to the person inside, "If the election were held today," and the person yells back, "I would be grateful." And I think that speaks to a lot of us, is that with presidential campaigns and even regular campaigns like this year starting so early, by the time we get to, I don't know, I'm going to say practically Labor Day, we're burnt out.
No kidding. Tom and Madison,
Yeah.
Jamie, thank you for the call. And it's certainly another aspect of these states competing as opposed to cooperating in national primaries is the disenfranchisement of voters who come down later on the list when it feels like the decision's already been made. Tom and Madison called, couldn't stay with us. He's wondering about the existence of non-citizen voting, if that is happening, and if so, why?
Okay, so for the most part, I'm going to say the answer is no. They do not vote. They do not vote. They're not allowed to vote. States already have tools in place to prevent that from occurring. And I also point out that for non-citizens who, especially those whose legal status is questionable here, let's say they're not without proper documentation, to now cast a ballot to vote, which is a felony in most states, which would subject you to either imprisonment or to deportation. They're not going to do it. That's just not going to do it. And so the idea that there is this rush of non-citizens showing up to vote, again, is largely a myth.
But that myth has real consequences, and there are real results because of it. So going forward, from your perspective, David Schultz, what would you like to see? What could we do to help enfranchise voters, protect the outcome, and have a true representative republic?
Okay, several different things. Each one could be a show in and of itself.
We got a couple minutes.
One of them would be, of course, I would say to have explicitly in the Constitution language that affirmatively guarantees a right to vote. That's the first thing. Okay. Second, I would probably get rid of the Electoral College or significantly reform it. Third, I'm going to offer something very, very controversial here. Okay. I did a discussion with a Canadian radio station a few weeks ago about voter ID, and they said, Schultz, we don't get it. We have a universal ID here. People are issued very young, and they have to show when you're voting. To take the whole debate out of voter impersonation, I would issue universal IDs to everybody. Now, this is incredibly controversial, but in order to resolve the debate, I would say, okay, we're issued our ID. We show up. Everybody has them, but you don't have to go through this complex process right now of producing birth certificates and all kinds of stuff that states are doing. We basically make it affordable and possible for people to do them, and that would maybe take away some of the skepticism about voting in America. I would also do things such as, for example, expand more early voting, maybe make voting a national holiday, state holiday, all possibilities.
I think those all sound like possibilities, but the argument against the national ID card, as you see it, David, would be what?
I think it's the big brother fear from both sides. I think for both the libertarian left and the libertarian right, it's the idea that a universal ID card now lets Big Brother figure out who we are or spy on us, et cetera, et cetera. And that may be a perfectly viable argument to make.
But at the same time, it would also curb the arguments that people are voting illegally, although those arguments have been shown to have little to no evidence behind them.
Absolutely correct at this point. In states that have enacted voter ID laws and other kinds of things, they're not detecting any. Some of them, like Indiana, had no incidents of voter fraud beforehand. They enacted voter ID, no incidences afterwards. So again, going back to my original statement before, we're in bowling a 300-game hole-in-one struck by lightning issue.
I was thinking about being bit by sharks because it makes national news, although if you're not next to the water, you're not going to have to worry about it.
How about being bit by a shark in Wisconsin?
David Schultz, it is always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for your wealth of information, and I very much look forward to the opportunity to catching up with you again.
Same here. It was a joy. Thank you very much.
David Schultz, Distinguished University Professor of Political Science and Legal Studies at Hamline University, also a professor of law at the University of St. Thomas Law School, a professor at the Lithuanian Military Academy, and the next edition of his constitutional law book will be out soon. I'm Lee Rayburn, and you're listening to WPR News. At the end of the day, on May 5th, 1886, in Bayview, just right outside Milwaukee at the time before it was incorporated, there were 7 dead. It was part of the deadliest day in labor organizing history in the state of Wisconsin. The story behind it and the legacy of it told to us by our next guest. And if you have a question about organized labor in Wisconsin and our history or its legacy, you can join us at 1-800-642-1234. That's 800-642-1234. You can send an email to talk@wpr.org. Here to share the story of the Bayview rolling mill tragedy is Jacqueline Kelly, Executive Director of the Wisconsin Labor History Society and a member of OPEIU Local 9 and Workers United Local 122. Jacqueline, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having us on today.
The Wisconsin Labor History Society, it's part of our historical society, isn't it?
Well, we have what's considered an affiliate relationship with the Wisconsin Historical Society. We were founded in 1981 with support from the Wisconsin AFL-CIO, history academics from around the state, and several folks from the Wisconsin Historical Society were directly involved in our founding as well.
What's the importance to the labor history, to Wisconsin's history? What's the connection there as you see it?
Well, I mean, Wisconsin is a state of working people. So when we talk about the struggles of working people in this state, we really are just talking about our own history. Also, the labor movement has done so much to shape our lives. You know, when we talk about our jobs, we're talking about our access to resources like money to buy the things that we need, to retire with dignity, to have access to healthcare. And so when we talk about the contributions of labor, we're actually talking about something that has a direct and meaningful impact on people's lives.
When you take us back to 1886, the thing that you just mentioned and listed off and that many of us workers take for granted, those were not available to workers at the time.
No, it was a very different context for people's jobs, their working lives. There was very little in the way, if anything, anything like retirement benefits, access to doctors, and in particular, this struggle that we're going to be chatting about today, the length of their workday, the hours upon hours that they had to work at their jobs.
So what was it like to work in a mill in Milwaukee in the 1880s? What was your life like then?
Well, at this time, people generally worked a 10-hour day, 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. That included Saturday work as well. Certain industries like brewery workers may have even worked even longer, although the brewery workers as a somewhat, I don't know, perhaps privileged group of workers did enjoy a somewhat leisurely pace of work as well as frequent breaks to enjoy the fruits of their labor.
Were they paid in beer back then?
They weren't. No, they weren't. They didn't receive their pay was not in beer. No, they did receive actual money for their work, but they were able to enjoy some drinks along the way.
So May 5th, 1886, leading up to that, there is the national series of events. There is a push for an 8-hour workday, which, again, I think many folks kind of take for granted today. But at the time, these folks, the mill workers, were working 60-hour weeks. What was the movement like in Milwaukee?
Well, here in Milwaukee, it did have sort of a certain character that's not necessarily reflected at the national level. I will say briefly at the national level, the push for this was happening at the national level, and so there were actually 2 organizations. The Federation of Organized Trades and Labor Unions first put out a call back in 1884, calling on all their members to push for this nationwide. And then the Knights of Labor, a name that might be a little bit more familiar to folks familiar with history, sort of somewhat grudgingly took up this call. The leader at the national level, the Grand Master Workman, was a man named Terrence Powderly, who actually really did not like strikes and boycotts and this sort of more like militant pressure tactics. And so Powderly sort of inherited this push for the 8-hour day from the FOTLU, and he didn't really like it, and instead encouraged their members to write essays on the 8-hour day to be published on Washington's birthday. So as I think folks who are familiar with history may be thinking as well, the history of really any mass movements for justice in this country demonstrate that you do have to apply pressure to powerful people to get what you want. And writing letters to the editor is probably not, It's not going to work. Um, at the local level, there was quite a bit going on here as well. Milwaukee was at the time, particularly in Bayview, was a big ironworking city due to the railroads coming through here. And this call for the 8-hour day was not unfamiliar to Milwaukee working class people. Workers in Milwaukee had pursued this as far back as 1865 with the election of Mayor John J. Talmadge and 1882 with the election of Mayor John M. Stowell, both of which included 8-hour days in their election platforms. A piece of the local context as well. So as I just noted, there were two different organizations at the national level both working on this. That was reflected at the local level, but there was also a significant amount of conflict within the local labor community. So the Milwaukee Knights of Labor was sort of, the local iteration of this national group. They were led by a man named Robert Schilling. There was another group called the Central Labor Union, which was very, very new. They had just been founded on March 31st, 1886, out of a conflict with the Milwaukee KOL, and as a successor to the almost defunct Milwaukee Trades Assembly. So they only had about 5,300 members, give or take, whereas the local Knights of Labor had like well over 16,000.
And so was there some dispute between the Milwaukee Knights of Labor and this new upstart Central Labor Union? Were these organized laborers disorganized?
Yeah, I mean, they did come together to fight for the 8-hour day, but they were very different in tactics and philosophy. So the Central Labor Union was led by a fiery German-born socialist named Paul Grotkow, who had been born in Berlin but moved to the United States to actually escape the German anti-socialist law of 1878. So Central Labor Union was a little more radical in orientation. They also did a lot more to organize amongst so-called unskilled workers, which at the time did include a lot of Polish workers, although certainly the Knights had a lot of Polish workers in their ranks as well. The Knights of Labor, to their I guess credit, were mostly ignoring Grandmaster Workman Terence Powderly's caution in avoiding strikes and boycotts. They were willing to boycott, but they didn't want to strike, basically. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'm just the way you set this up. Then I think of I think of the story leading up to May 5th, 1886, and I think that I think it was in the book The Making of Milwaukee, where a few days before that, as many as half of the working men of Milwaukee said we're on strike. So this strike did seem to catch fire. There did seem to be a popular uprising here, and it all seems to be leading to this rolling mill in Bayview.
Yeah. So as I noted, despite their differences in tactics and philosophy, these two organized groups did come together to make sort of a temporary situation-specific organization they called the 8-Hour League, which had initially been founded by the Knights of Labor, but did have some delegates from the Central Labor Union. The Central Labor Union, though, over time did take over direction of the League. And so they did come together through this in order to fight for this. So one of the big accomplishments of this 8-Hour League was that they did pressure the Milwaukee Common Council to establish an 8-hour day for city workers back in March of 1886, so a couple months before the events of the massacre. And so this was seen as sort of like a wedge, that if they could accomplish this for this group of workers, sooner or later they could, extend the benefits to privately employed groups of workers as well.
So, and these private workers then walk off the job, but isn't that rolling mill that they end up at on May 5th, 1886 seems to be one of the last operating mills in the midst of all these protests?
Yes. Yeah. So if we think of this as sort of a sequence of events going from May 1st through May 5th, you're correct. By May 1st, one historian estimates that there were 12,000 people out on the streets away from their jobs. So it's probably the closest thing to a general strike we've had so far in Milwaukee. And in fact, at this time, the brewery workers walked out of their jobs as well. And they actually were not striking for the 8-hour day. They were in a separate conflict with their employers, and they just decided, you know what, we're out too. And so they joined the ranks out in the streets.
And that means that the police were outnumbered, which would probably explain why the governor would call in the state militia.
Yeah, well, they did. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. So actually, Governor Rusk came to Milwaukee.
It's
He arrived
Jeremiah
in
Rusk. So he is,
yes,
he's not in Milwaukee, but then the protesters take to the street. So he's like, I should be there.
yeah, yep. He came to Milwaukee. Probably it was on either Sunday, May 2nd or Monday, May 3rd. Initially, the local leadership in Milwaukee, by which I mean Mayor Emil Wahlberg and Sheriff George Passion, felt that they could handle the situation without state level support. But eventually, by Tuesday, May 4th, the state and county put in a request to the governor, and they sent in many units from other places in Wisconsin. And so by the evening of Tuesday, May 4th, there were about 800 guardsmen in Milwaukee.
But that still would pale in comparison to the protesters. And when you get to May 5th, the count that I've seen is about 1,500 protesters facing off against 800 militia members. And were they all around this Bayview rolling mill because it's the one that's operating and they need to keep it open?
Yes. Well, I mean, obviously the employer wished to keep it open.
Mm-hmm.
The workers in the community wished it to be closed. And it was basically the last one standing in the area.
Why was this
Robert
one
Oz-
standing? Why was the rolling mill left open when the other ones had workers walk off? Do we know?
Well, the workers there had like mostly walked off, but
Oh.
they had sort of a skeleton crew that managed to keep it open. And the owner of the rolling mill, I guess, was just a little more obstinate than one of the other close to last holdouts was Edward P. Alice of the Reliance Works, which that name is certainly familiar to
Yes.
Wisconsin audiences of West Dallas. And it's also interesting because the Alice Chalmers Company figures very large in Wisconsin labor history going into the 20th century as well. So that's a separate story that we don't have time to get into right now. But yeah, Alice was a big deal in Wisconsin labor history.
So May 5th, 1886, 1,500 protesters are marching towards the Bayview Rolling Mill, surrounded by 800 state militia.
Mm-hmm.
Was it chaos? What ensued? Did the governor give the order to shoot? How did the violence begin?
Yeah, well, the crowd, so different historians give like different numbers, but you are more or less correct at 1,500. Robert Ozanne says 1,000. Bernhard Secorn and Robert Nesbitt both say 1,500. They were marching from St. Stanislaus, which was a big Catholic parish on Milwaukee's southeast side that served as sort of a, community gathering place for the local Polish community. And this gathering place and the fact that there were so many Polish ethnics involved in this actually was part of what made this such a sad and difficult situation. So as I noted, the state militia had been called this, and that included several, groups within the militia. One of those groups was the Kosciuszko Guard, which was made up mostly of Polish, like middle class business people. And they actually met in the parish school at St. Stanislaus. So when the Kosciuszko Guard showed up the day before on May 4th, this caused a huge issue. I mean, a lot of people in the crowd were very upset, hollering at what they viewed as their countrymen who were there working against them, throwing rocks at them. And it caused so much agitation amongst the soldiers that they did discharge their weapons on May 4th. They shot over their heads and no one was harmed. But they became so sort of agitated and frustrated that they shot over their heads prior to actually shooting into the crowd on May 5th.
Did the governor give the order to shoot?
He sure did. He wasn't present personally, but they called him on the telephone and he gave the order, "Very well, sir, fire on them."
The argument from the protesters, and I think it was quoted as 8 hours of work, 8 hours of rest, and 8 hours of what we will, which was a pretty good slogan. I'm always kind of wondered what the other side's argument was, that we can't afford to have you have 8 hours of work, 8 hours of rest, and 8 hours of what you will. What's the counter to the protesters?
Well, I can tell you that there had been a confrontation at the rolling mill, as I said, the day before on May 4th. And folks like Robert Schilling and a committee of workers had been in conference with the plant manager, John C. Parks. And his claim, specific, I suppose, to that industry, was that the 8-hour day was just somehow not applicable to mill work, which is, I guess, sort of um, just sort of pretending like this is something that just happens, like the rising of the sun and the rolling of the tides, that it just somehow doesn't apply
This is the
here,
way
which
it
is always,
is. This is the
it's just the way it
way.
is, guys. You guys just have to accept it and work till you drop. Yeah.
Jacqueline Kelly is our guest, executive director of the Wisconsin Labor History Society, talking about the Bayview rolling mill tragedy of May 5th, 1886, that left 7 dead, including a 12-year-old boy. And so if you've got a question, you can join us at 1-800-642-1234, 800-642-1234, or talk@wpr.org. So the governor gives the order to fire, and this time, on this day, a day later, the militia fires into the crowd, and I imagine that the crowd scatters except for the 7 bodies on the ground. What's the immediate aftermath of this violence?
Well, the violence accomplished what it was meant to, which was to create chaos and disorder and fear amongst the populace. As you note, there were several deaths. I will just say briefly that it is, John Gerda takes the position, and I think with the society we would agree with this as well. It's difficult to know exactly how many passed. The newspapers at the time give a number of 9. But trying to corroborate that with death certificates is difficult. Some historians give a number as low as 5. I can tell you that several of the names that frequently pop up as different historians have examined this question are Michael Rouchakis, Francis Kunkel, Johann Mazka, except Johann Mazka might have actually been John Marsh. That will probably forever be a mystery. Martin Jankowicz, Robert Erdman, Frank Nowarchek, and Albert Erdman. Now, Frank was the boy you mentioned, and it really was a tragic thing. He was a schoolboy, and he literally fell on his school books as he was walking around outside. So really a tragic thing.
In the long-term ramifications of this day, I mean, we can sit here today and say that we have an 8-hour workday today that was part of a national movement that was adopted eventually, regardless of what the mill operator had to tell the protesters before that. But there's also the history of socialism in Milwaukee that seems to have come after that. And I just saw this as well, that Bayview became incorporated into Milwaukee just a year after this shooting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there were a lot of repercussions locally and nationally. The labor movement did not accomplish the 8-hour day as it hoped to in 1886. But in the wake of the national push in 1886, the Knights of Labor sort of disintegrated for a variety of reasons. One of which, perhaps of interest to Milwaukee audiences, is that their leader, Grandmaster Workman Terrence Powderly, was a committed prohibitionist. And so all the brewery workers were like, we're out. That's not going to work for us. And it's kind of around the time that Knights of Labor falling apart, that federation I mentioned earlier was not very strong to begin with. Towards the end of the year of 1886, the AFL starts to come together and pick up all those scattered pieces. And the AFL continued to pursue this, although it was not accomplished actually until the Roosevelt administration. Locally, there was a lot of fallout from this. As you can imagine, within the Polish community, the situation was quite ugly. As I mentioned, several of the members of the Kosciuszko Guard were sort of like middle-class business people type. Many of them had their businesses close to ruined due to sort of informal boycotts amongst the community. Legally, locally, a coroner's jury actually praised the militia and returned no indictments for them shooting into the crowd. But several folks from the labor side were charged with a variety of charges. The stiffest sentence came to Central Labor Union leader Paul Grotkow, who was sentenced to a year in jail, although he used his time wisely and ran for mayor from jail.
Did he win?
Yes. No, he did not. And
Vote for me, I'm in jail.
Yeah, he didn't serve the full year. It was actually only a couple months.
Okay.
But it did create a turn to political action amongst Milwaukee's and Wisconsin's labor community. What was left of the Knights of Labor pursued a People's Party that actually got successfully several people elected, including a full slate in Milwaukee County, although this actually is related to the charges against Paul Grotkow, because the district attorney at the time was able to get a lot of the charges against Robert Schilling and other Knights of Labor folks dismissed. Grotkow got a year in jail. And I can't verify if this is true or not, but Paul Grotkow always blamed Robert Schilling for that.
Oh, wow.
He always felt that there had been sort of a connection between Robert Schilling and the Knights of Labor and this district attorney that was elected, and he personally blamed Robert Schilling. So they managed to unite enough to get through the November elections. And then right after that was when Paul Grotkow was sentenced. And clearly after that, their relationship it wasn't super strong to begin with, but it was pretty much done by then.
Let's go to Rick in Madison now. Rick, hi.
Hi. I'm a labor historian also. And first I want to say how much I appreciate your guest today and the accuracy of her comments and the level of sophistication. It's really marvelous. About 20 years ago, I published, or the Historical Society published my book, A City at War, Milwaukee Labor During World War II. And I tried to answer the question, why, if we were more unified then than ever before or since, is there still labor conflict? And the answer is because business and labor don't have identical interests. And I'd like your guest to comment about the importance, the way in which history informs the need and the importance of organizing and of organized labor. And I'll get off the phone and listen.
Rick, thank you for the call. Jacqueline?
Well, first off, Rick, certainly thank you for calling in. And I have read your book. So it's really nice to hear from you here. All right. So the question was the importance of history and sort of organizing today and everything.
Yeah.
So I think a big piece of that is that the way we understand the past informs the way we understand the present. And that is really part of why the Labor History Society was founded. A big part of our mission is getting labor story into Wisconsin schools and colleges. And so, a lot of the history we receive in school or sometimes in popular media like the History Channel, it does tend to sort of leap from like powerful businessman to powerful businessman. And a study of labor history helps us understand that organizing is not only possible, it is an effective way to improve your life. That regular people, by coming together through structures like unions, can actually meaningfully impact their lives and the lives of people that come after them and make them better. So that's just a quick answer, I think, to Rick's question.
That these magnates weren't the ones responsible for 8-hour workdays, for weekends, for the opportunity for retirement and affordable health care.
The big thing, I think, this story teaches us a couple different things, but one of the big ones is that any benefits we enjoy in the workplace, they are not gifts from benevolent management. Truly, they were fought and died for by working people who came before us.
And the deadliest battle in Wisconsin would have been May 5th, 1886. And regardless of how many dead there, this was a strike that actually struck the conscience of the Milwaukee community, and there was a result. There were ramifications thereafter, some political, some social, and some that you would say probably still reverberate to this day.
Yeah, I believe so. We put on our annual event every year, which the most recent socialist mayor of Milwaukee, Frank Seiler, was a great supporter of. And it's a really special event. We enjoy a lot of support from the Milwaukee Area Labor Council, Bayview Historical Society, and of course, as always, the Wisconsin AFL-CIO. And at this point, we've been doing this for 40 years, and we typically have well over 200 people who come together every year in this sort of very deeply felt ritual of remembrance of these people who lost their lives.
I know it's a little bit early, but I probably won't talk to you in a couple of weeks. So, Jacqueline, I'll say now, happy Labor Day, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Yes, thank you. Happy Labor Day to you and your audiences.
Jacqueline Kelly, Executive Director of the Wisconsin Labor History Society, joining us to take a look at the May 5th, 1886 tragedy that took place at the Bayview Rolling Mill. I'm Lee Rayburn, and you are listening to WPR News. You can't tell the history of America's dairyland without telling the history of Latinos in Wisconsin. I'm Lee Rayburn, and our next guest is a labor leader and activist. Jesus Salas joins us, and he is a historian. He's the author of his memoir, Obreros Unidos, The Roots and Legacy of the Farm Workers Movement, an activist who led the historic march of Mexican migrants from Wautoma to Madison in 1966 as part of organizing for Wisconsin's first farm workers union. Salas was later a lecturer at UW-Madison and UW-Milwaukee, an appointee to the UW System Board of Regents, and the first Latino CEO of United Migrant Opportunity Services. If you have a question for him and his life's work or a story to share, we welcome you here at 1-800-642-1234. That's 800-642-1234, or send an email to talk@wpr.org. And Jesus, it is a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you very much for the invitation.
I want to start with where we are today with you, because you have worked from outside the system to better migrant farmers and dairy farmers' lives in Wisconsin. You have worked from inside the system to help students and help Latinos across the state. And I'm wondering what you see as our state today and where we find migrant workers in Wisconsin today and how they are faring.
Well, when we started, I'm a third generation migrant worker. My grandfather crossed the Mexican border in 1906, lost a homestead during the Depression, started migrating, showed my dad how to get to Wisconsin. He came here in 1942. My second oldest brother was born here. His younger brother, my uncle Julian, served with the Red Arrow Division when he signed up for the selective service in that year and served in Japan. And the war interrupted the migration, but we joined my father in the early 50s, and for the next 8 years, migrating, journeying up to the Midwest, including the state of Wisconsin. So that was my introduction to the state of Wisconsin back as a child.
And where do you see the fight today that you led for so long here?
Well, in terms of the issues that are going on in our community right now, the thugs that are attacking our community and the ICE attacks on our community, the removing of the so-called, what did President Trump say, the worst are happening to be our next door neighbors, relatives of ours, even within our own family that we've been here since 1906, we still include family members who were born across the border, that is, who are not documented and they continue to suffer the ravages of these attacks that are ongoing presently in our community by the ICE.
But we couldn't have this community, we couldn't have this economy, as I understand it, without migrant farmers. Is that how you see it, Jesus?
Absolutely. When we were migrant workers back in the late 50s, early 60s, when I was a migrant worker, my family was a migrant worker, there were over 100,000 migrants coming into the Midwest. There were 15,000 to the state of Wisconsin. And as Wisconsin developed, and you mentioned the dairy industry, but all across rural Wisconsin, I'm talking about Clyman, I'm talking about Cambria, I'm talking about River Falls, Hartford, Wisconsin, small communities. The processing and canning of the food products that were being processed there with the help of these thousands of migrant workers, we're feeding the growing Midwestern urban areas. And ever since then, we've been an integral part not only of the development of that agricultural industry, including the dairy industry here in Wisconsin, but in our contribution throughout the Midwest urban area by feeding them.
I feel as though, Jesus, it's not that dairy farmers in Wisconsin aren't necessarily migrants, because dairy farming is year-round. It is every day, multiple times a day.
Multiple times a day, yes.
These are more Latino farmers who work on dairy farms in Wisconsin. And do we still see them as integral to our agriculture economy today?
Absolutely. The Mexican laborers that work, as you said, at least twice a day in those dairy farms make up over 50% of the agricultural enterprise. And we're still, I think California has just gone ahead of as far as milk production is concerned. but we're still a very vibrant dairy industry, including, of course, cheese making. But Mexicans are still, and many of them, by the way, Lee, are undocumented. They're recently arrived Mexican immigrants. I mean, recently, I mean, in the last couple of decades. I'm talking about my grandfather who came here over 100 years ago.
But
We certainly,
but Mexican and Latinos in Wisconsin are nothing new. In fact, I think they date back all the way to like the 1880s. They were getting here when European settlers were arriving.
absolutely, absolutely. Sergio Gonzalez, a professor of Marquette University, speaks of them, and of course, in our community, we refer to them as los primeros, the first ones. And over the weekend, we celebrated the Mexican fiesta, and of course, we honor their contribution because they were the first to celebrate their presence in the community. And Holy Trinity in the near South Side later became Bruce Guadalupe in those early days. And when I moved to Milwaukee from organizing in the fields to carry out the California Grape Boycott, it was the archdiocese who. At that time, had to just open up offices at 524 West National, that is the President Walker Point's neighborhood, and working out of there, just down the street, Father Grappi and the commandos were marching from the north side to Allen Bradley, demanding the end of the racism and the hiring of Latinos and blacks at that company. And I joined them, and it was just an unforgettable experience with the intersection of the farm workers movement and the black civil rights movement.
Could we have a farm workers movement today like we did, considering the current political climate that we find ourselves in? Could you pull off today what you were able to succeed in large part with in the 1960s?
Well, there isn't a number. As I said, there were 5,000. Automation had depleted the number of migrants coming in. Most of the Mexicans and Mexican Americans that are coming into Milwaukee are coming directly from the Texas borderlands directly to the urban areas. They're not stopping at doing field work prior to coming here as we did in our generation, or as the Los Primeros did when they established residency in Walker's Point neighborhood more than 100 years ago.
So migrant workers are not as much of a part of our economy as they were?
We're spread out. We're spread out over to the processing plants in the meat industry and construction and dairy farms. They're not. No, they're not. There's not as many. There's not as many field workers that are needed to produce the foods that are being produced here in the Midwest and in the state of Wisconsin. We're now dispersed all over Wisconsin and in urban areas throughout the Midwest.
What about considering your experiences both outside the system to change the system, inside the system to evolve the system, what advice do you have for organizers today who are looking to make the quality of life better for workers in Wisconsin?
Well, we started organizing not individual heads of household, as I saw when I first came here in the 60s, was the focus of the organizing by the unions. In other words, since the field work was a family workforce, we organized the whole family, and we lived in migrant labor camps. So when I was going into the migrant labor camps to organize farm workers, the whole family would sit around and we'd talk to the whole family, or that is, men and women of all ages. So I think that the response, or the farm workers union as such, was a family made up just like the workforce was, and so that you have the women's movement and the youth movement being part of the union movement. It wasn't separate from it, and I think that was unique when we come to the urban areas and we continue to organize families. One of the experiences, for instance, wherever we journeyed to work, Henry, Illinois was our first spot because the asparagus sprout used to come out earlier in spring, the thawing out of the frost would see them emerge. So my dad would put us in Henry, Illinois elementary school. So for 4 years, those years that we picked this harvest asparagus, I was in Henry, Illinois elementary school, and I graduated in 1957. I attended 3 different high schools. So when I came to Milwaukee, just like I had done, I had left my studies at Oshkosh State when I enrolled after high school. So I enrolled at UW Milwaukee. And UW Milwaukee had an enrollment of 25,000 university students, and all the Latinos could sit around one table. And so we started organizing, by the way, because as I said, we had first been housed at the archdiocese there, and the archdiocese program was attempting to teach recently arrived migrants English. And then when UMass was funded in 1965, United Migrant Opportunity Services, they continued to provide adult basic education. But in order to be a teacher, you needed 4 years of college. So these organizations, UMass and the Spanish centers and other community organizations, as a family, it started to organize the opening up of the University of Wisconsin, because in order to advance, in order even to learn English, we had to train teachers. And in order to train teachers, we have to have access to UWM. So in between 1967, 68, and 69, whole families, just like we organized in the labor camps, would start picketing the chancellor's office to open up access to the university and to establish what at that time was called the Spanish-speaking Outreach Institute. So my first lesson would be to any future organizer: don't organize the head of the households. Organize the whole family. Organize the husband, the wife, and the children, and talk to them all at once at what your aims are as far as the organization initiative that you bring to them.
You talk about the UW system, which eventually Governor Jim Doyle appoints you as a member of the Board of Regents there for the UW system. What was your work like inside the system to try to evolve the system? How did you operate once you got inside the UW?
Well, I had learned one more aspect in there in terms of the university system, because when I graduated several years later, I enrolled at UW-Madison. So I had an idea of what not only the two doctoral institutions in the state, UWM and UW-Madison. And UW-Madison, because of this focus on academic programs and such, we were demanding for them to provide academic courses that reflected the lived experiences of the Latinos, of the Mexican American, and other diverse groups within our community. And that took almost 12 years. So it wasn't until they were very resistant to, the University of Wisconsin, it was a great place to be in, but they didn't like to be told what academic courses should be taught. So it took us a long time to establish that. So that experience also gave me a different view of just the differences of our campuses. That is, UWM, I had been to Oshkosh State College right after high school, and now later at UW-Madison. So when I sat at the Board of Regents, I had a very basic knowledge as to what the diversity of the institutions that made up at that time the UW system. So I attempted to, for instance, at that time the whole issue of the undocumented. When we came here, there was no distinction between being documented and undocumented in the fields or in the factories. But when we got to the university, at that time the undocumented were being charged out-of-state students. So when I went and talked to the chancellors, I say, hey, you guys provide scholarships for out-of-state tuition for your athletes and some of the scholars that you want to bring into these great institutions. Why can't you do it to qualified undocumented students? So that was one of the focuses that I wanted to work with as far as the two major doctoral institutions, to allow all of our students, all of our qualified students, documented and undocumented. And it was really a challenge. But I resigned from the UW Regents in order to carry out what we call the in-state tuition for the undocumented Governor Doyle had difficulty getting one of the houses in the legislature to pass in-state tuition for the undocumented. So I joined Voces de la Frontera, and I thought I'd do a more effective job in working in the streets, or that is working with the individual legislators. And we finally passed it in 2008, only to be rescinded by Governor Walker when he rescinds our right to organize by passing Act 10. So I come out of retirement and start working and trying to get rid of the governor and reinstate the in-state tuition.
Jesus Salas, our guest, Wisconsin labor activist, historian, his memoir, Obreros Unidos, The Roots and Legacy of the Farm Workers Movement. You can join our conversation at 1-800-642-1234. That's 800-642-1234. You can send an email to talk@wpr.org. You mentioned Act 10, Jesus, and I would like to know from your perspective how you see the organized labor movement as it stands today, and the rights of workers in Wisconsin.
Well, the Act 10 denied over 170,000 public employees here in the state of Wisconsin the right to bargain collectively for their wages and working conditions. But it goes further than that in terms of its the dramatic negative effects on the core of teachers here, because a lot of the teachers who had been paid and were waiting for their pensions or had to take a shot at losing their health and hospitalization resigned earlier, that is, left their teaching corps. And ever since then, there's been a disruption in terms of these older teachers leaving earlier than they thought, just simply to have access to their pensions and to their health and hospitalization, and a lot of new teachers that are coming in and then facing the last 15 years of the Republican legislature that refuses to fund our public schools, and the whole charter movement that takes money from public funds to our public institutions, starts giving it to charter schools, and just puts us in a horrible position. It's still going on to this day. We still haven't resolved those issues that were initiated by Act 10. Just a disaster. And of course, the issue is coming up before the Wisconsin Supreme Court later on, and it's not going to be the easiest thing, even if they do resolve to give us the right to collective bargaining, starting all over again, just like the farm workers did when they attempted to organize their rights to collective bargaining. The new public school system faculty members and staff are going to attempt to establish their own rights to sit down with the employers, the school boards, and attempt to negotiate collectively once again.
But from the perspective of those that you disagree with, perhaps in the state legislature, do you see an argument that they would make on behalf of school choice for parents as a way of expanding the charter school system? Do you see the argument that was made over Act 10 that it could provide for more affordable state legislature or state budget?
I see very little collaboration with their thoughts, even with their own community, because I have that same discussion with those individual Mexicans or Mexican Americans, Latinos who belong, are very strong Catholics, or are very strong, belong to different religious groups that are not taking funds to initiate these charter schools. I don't think some of them are very successful at this, or that is, have very high rates of their children graduating from their high schools that go on to post-secondary educational institutions, but many don't. Many don't, and it's just I don't think. I think they take money from the public institutions, and they don't really do the job we were attempting to do in the public system. So neither of us are serving our students, whether it's Latinos in charter schools or Latinos in the public education there isn't the funds to be able to fund both of them. We have to make a decision, and we're going to be faced with one once we decide what to do with the surplus. That surplus money has to be going to those public schools. Look at where that money is going to go. It's going to be going to special needs. It's going to be going to those needs that have been unattended for years in our public schools. Our bilingual education, our English learners. Those needs have not been met. And here we're having demands by the charter schools. Yes, I understand. Some of them are successful, but not all of them. And we have to decide what we're going to do with that situation.
Let's take
It's
a
a
call.
problem. It's a problem that we're facing, Lee. It's not a problem that has been solved. No.
Thank you. Pardon me. Thank you for that. Jesus Salas, our guest. Let's go to Jack at Madison next. Hi, Jack.
Hey, Lee. Hey, Zeus. It's been interesting hearing you guys talk about, recent plight of farm labor in our state. I heard you guys just talking about the dairy industry, and of course, we all know what would Wisconsin be if not for dairy. And it got me thinking. My dad happens to know the executive director of the Wisconsin Cheesemakers Association, and we've been hearing stories about, the administration's crackdown on farm labor and how, dairies in our state have taken a hit. And I wondered if Jesus might be able to speak to fight about farm labor, especially in the dairy industry, or what some of the statistics from that might have been.
Jesus, do we know how many workers we've lost as a result of concerns over immigration enforcement from the Trump administration and what that may do to things like our cheese economy?
I don't know specifically how it relates to that particular industry. I know that some of the individuals that are responding to, I understand that there's close to 700,000 deportees already since the ICE crackdown on our community started. There's around 65,000 detainees in the detention center throughout the United States, and the arrests are almost the equivalent. The ongoing arrests are almost the equivalent of the number of deportees, but they don't jive because a lot of the detainees in this new detention center don't tell the whole story because some of them are being detained in local law enforcement systems. Now, I do know the impact that they're having on the industry because now it is not just the agricultural industry. There are some of the individuals in construction that are on their own, silently approaching the present administration and saying, "Hey, ease up, because we don't have enough people to be able to sustain this housing law that just passed, and we don't have the workforce in the construction with all of the deportees that you're having and that impact." So it's not just agricultural; it's going into the construction industry. This right here in Chicago and in the Ohio state, we're hearing that the Haitians who had been getting temporary status, their impact on the health industry and of the caring for the ages. Some of those individuals in those industries are saying, wait a minute, do not get rid of all these individuals. You're going to impact the care of the health services for this group and that group. So people are finally starting to realize the contribution of these families on other industries. And I'm sure if the ICE were to focus on the dairy industry, they would be the dairy farmers who would be the first one to be heard. I know I've met him in advocating for a different legislative initiative that would maintain their workforce stable. They've been at the state capitol along with Voces de la Frontera, the immigrant rights group, and alongside some of us that are advocating for a fair legislative initiative federally. So I'm sure that it would have an impact. I haven't heard that they're impacting the dairy industry to this time.
Jesus, I apologize. We're going to have to leave it there, but I would like to invite you back. I feel like we've got a lot more to talk about on this, and you'd be a perfect person to speak with.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation, especially following Jacqueline and that dramatic story that he told us about the 8-hour workday. I was very moved by that.
Jesus Salas, labor activist and historian in Wisconsin.